Hey, welcome back to another episode of Grace, Grit, and Grounds. I'm so glad you chose to join us today. So, I picked up this piece knowing full well that it had a past. It's a big walnut slab, wide, solid, the kind of piece that almost dares you to ruin it. Plenty of room to work, plenty of room for things to go wrong. Some of you listening right now you're holding it together, but just barely. Everything looks solid on the outside. You're showing up, you're doing the work, you're carrying the weight. But if we're both being honest, there are probably a few places underneath where if the pressure hits just right, the whole thing could give away. That's where this piece kind of started for me. Like I said, it's a big slab of walnut. It's heavy, it's wide, and full of promise. In fact, it's about 2 inches thick, pushing about 10 inches across. The kind of piece that makes you slow down a little bit before you even turn the lathe on because you know it's got potential. Of course, there's also risk because with something this wide, you don't get to hide your mistakes. I started shaping the outside first, let it open up into this broad, almost saucer form. Not deep, not really tight, just trying to go for this wide space. I wanted a bit of honesty, the kind of shape that feels like it's meant to hold something even before you know what that something is. And the grain, man, the grain was there. Deep, walnut, heartwood, rich, dark, almost like it's been holding on to something for years. I tried to chase a little bit of sapwood to see if I could keep that contrast. As I've mentioned before, I just love that contrast between the light colored sapwood and then the interior heartwood. Unfortunately, there just wasn't enough there to save, so what I'm left with is all heartwood, which isn't really a problem because what I get is depth, all depth. No contrast to hide behind, just the real thing. And then comes the part that always gets me a little uneasy when I make that reverse tenon. Now, if you've never turned wood before, then that's where you shape the bottom in a way that lets you flip the whole piece around and mount it directly onto the chuck. It's what holds everything steady while you hollow it out. But here's the thing. When you're working on a wide, shallow piece like I know this is going to be, the bottom gets thin, really thin. And every time I do it, there's this voice in the back of my head saying to me, don't push it too far. You're going to blow out the whole base and ruin the piece. At least that's the voice that I have in the back of my head. So I'm cutting it carefully. I'm checking my depth, feeling for that balance between enough material to hold and not so much that it ruins the form. Because if the base fails, it doesn't matter how good the rest of it looks. The whole piece is just done. And standing there at the lathe, working that shape, feeling that tension, I couldn't help but think, a lot of us are living right there, wide on the outside, holding a lot in, but underneath, we're running thinner than we'd like to admit. And then I saw it, right along the rim, a crack. Not a small one either, the kind that makes you stop the lathe and just stare at it for a second. Because now I've got a decision to make. I can ignore it and risk the whole piece coming apart later, or I can deal with it knowing that it's going to cost me time. So I stopped the lathe, and instead of pushing forward, I went backward. I took out some super glue and I filled the crack. And then I packed some sawdust into the crack from the very piece itself. I pressed it in, worked it down, make sure that I had something solid in that crack. This is an old woodworking tool. It's one way we have of maybe fixing a crack before it gets too far, before it ruins the piece. But there's no rushing this part because I can't muscle my way through it. I can't grit my teeth and force it to harden faster. It's going to take a little bit of time, whether I like it or not. I'm going to have to let this piece sit. I'm going to have to come back to it a day or two later. But as I'm putting the glue on, I can't help but wonder how much of this is like my life. I wonder how many times God has had to stop his lathe with me sitting there mounted, half finished, with a glaring crack. And I wonder how much spiritual glue he's had to press into those cracks over the years. I wonder if I would even notice after it was done. I can tell you the crack may seem small on the camera there. It may seem like it's not that much, but all it would take is that little crack to catch on the bowl gouge, and it would just shear off an entire side of that, and it would ruin the piece. I had to fix the crack. I had to put the glue on, put the sawdust on, and I had to take it off the lathe and come back to it another day. So I came back a couple days later, and I mounted it back up. I had to fix the back side of it a little bit and get it just ready, but obviously I could tell right off the bat that something had changed. It wasn't just stable. I think the piece itself was ready. As I worked down the back side, I knew it was time to get the inside done. And I need to get that refined shape. I needed it opening up. I needed it to be something that I could work with. And in this process, I realized that this wasn't really going to be a bowl anymore. I realized that it was going to be widened out. It was going to be something a little bigger than I originally planned, maybe a little flattened, more like a platter, that wide open feeling, almost like an offering plate you'd see on Sunday morning. It's not really what I had started off wanting to make, but maybe that's what it was always meant to be. And somewhere in the middle of all that, it hits me. That crack that I originally found didn't ruin the piece. It just redirected it. There's a lot of men walking around carrying cracks just like that. Places where life split a little wider than expected. Could have been a failure. Could have been a loss. Could have been something you didn't choose, but you still had to carry it. And most of us are tempted to do one of two things. Either ignore it, pretend it's not there, or maybe push through it, hoping that it won't get worse. But real strength? I think real strength stops the lathe, looks that crack in the eye and says, we're going to fix this right now. And here's the part that doesn't preach easy. Fixing takes time. It takes stepping away. It takes letting God do something beneath the surface that nobody sees. Because while we're sitting there feeling like nothing's happening, things are binding, things are setting, things are being made strong again. And when you come back to it, you're not the same shape you were before. You might not even be what you originally planned, but you're still useful. You're still strong. You're still capable of holding something meaningful. That piece of walnut that I'm working, it didn't become what I thought it would be, but it became something better suited for what it had been through. And maybe that's the word for somebody today, that you're not ruined. You're not wasted. You're just in the middle of being mended. My advice? Let it set. Let it heal. Then get back on the lathe. There's still something in you worth shaping. Moving back to the piece, I really start opening up the interior. It's a slow, steady process. I've sped up the videos so that you can get a sense of what I'm doing, but mostly I'm just letting the tool do the work. I'm not trying to rush it because I know I can't. because this is where true depth is formed. This is where the piece becomes what it's actually meant to be, not just something that looks good from the outside, but something that can really hold weight, something that can carry. And as I'm cutting into it, refining that curve, working from the rim down toward the center and back, you can start to see that happen. The grain is starting to really show itself. Not all at once, and I don't think it's all that loud, but little by little, that grain begins to rise. The lines that I couldn't see before start to become more prominent. Movement that was really always there, just waiting to be revealed, is starting to come to to the focus. And the bottom, that's the part I was really worried about. It still holds. It's carefully being shaped. I am worried about it, but it's not too thin, and I don't think in the end the bowl is going to be that heavy. But I still have to work the edge to make sure that it gets where it needs to be, because I want it to be strong enough to support everything above it, the bottom that is. But in the same process, I don't want it to be too thick. I need it to have that lovely, right depth. Somewhere in this process, it hits me again that a lot of what God does in us happens right here, not in the wide visible moments, but in the quiet cutting, the slow forming, the places where He's making room inside of you or me for something deeper. Then comes the sanding. I'll be honest, this is where the patience really gets tested. I'll use the drill in certain spots just to get things started, especially in some of the tighter areas. But to be honest, there's no shortcuts here. Most of it is just time and touch, hand sanding and working through the grits over and over again. The goal is to smooth out the tool marks, to take down some of the rough spots, refining what's already been shaped. It's not flashy work, but it is repetitive. It's quiet. It's easy to wonder sometimes if it even really matters, but I've known from experience that it does, because this is what prepares the surface for what comes next. It's the part that I'm moving towards, the part I can't wait for. In the process, though, I am using a little bit of the air compressor. I found that sometimes the sawdust can get into the finer places of the piece and will prevent the sanding from really having the full effect. Sometimes the sawdust actually does something even worse, where it will start sanding itself and causing some imperfections to come out. And I'm just trying to get rid of that as best I can. If you've been watching enough of these builds, you know that what I'm referring to is the oil. Getting ready to put the oil on the piece is what I'm looking for whenever I do any kind of project like this. There's just something about bringing out that dark, rich color. And like I've mentioned many times, that's one of the reasons why I love walnut so much, because it just soaks up that oil and comes out with a kind of beauty that, well, I just don't think you can get anywhere else. And maybe I'm a little biased because I'm a woodworker and this is what I love to do. That first pass across the wood, it changes everything. What looks dull comes alive. What looks what looked flat now has a depth beyond explanation. The grain that was hiding beneath the surface, it wakes up. It breathes. All that time, all that shaping, all that sanding, and now you can see it. That's the part I don't want you to miss. Because in our lives, we don't always get that moment right away. We don't always see what God is doing while He's doing it. But there will come a point where what He's been working on in you starts to show. And when it does, you realize something, that none of it was wasted. Not the crack, not the waiting, not the slow, unseen work. It was all part of bringing something out in us that couldn't have come any other way. And maybe that's where you are right now. Not just a small crack, but something that feels too far gone, too deep, maybe too wide to fix. Listen carefully. I can only do so much with a piece of wood. There are breaks that I can't save. There are moments when the damage wins. But that's the difference between me and Jesus. I'm just working with what's in my hands. He's the one who made you. There is no crack too wide. There is no failure too deep. There is no place in your life he can't reach into, mend, and make it whole again. So before you rush back to the lathe, before you push through on your own, bring it to him. Let him do the part that only he can do. If this spoke to you today, if somewhere in the middle of the sawdust and the struggle you found a little bit of clarity, go ahead and like the video and subscribe to the channel. It's not for the numbers, but because it helps that this kind of message will reach the kind of guys who's still out there in the shop or sitting in their truck trying to hold it all together on their own. You being here and taking that small step helps more people find something real in the middle of the noise. As I've said many times, my encouragement to you is simply this: that grace builds what grit sustains. But I've come to find that there's something a little bit more true, maybe something a little more real that we can add to this. Because I've come to the conclusion that grace fills what's been broken. Grit stays through the waiting. And in the end, you'll still hold something worth giving. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Grace, Grit, and Grounds. I hope that you've enjoyed this build. And I think that whenever we do this kind of work, we need to take a moment to just enjoy the fruit of our labor, to see the grain, to see the color, to see the polish, and to know that even in the midst of our struggles, our trials, and our tribulations, God is still on the throne, and He is still there for us. I can't wait until we see each other again. Until then, keep the conversation flowing and the coffee warm.